Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be carried away by varied and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, through which those who are so occupied were not benefited. We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So, let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For we here do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of the lips that give thanks to his name, and do not neglect good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. In my line of work, I do a lot of post-mortem analysis. I have performed many scores of autopsies and have seen the ravages of disease and illness as they take their toll on the human body. And so, being someone who's familiar with post-mortem analyses, I just wanted to offer a brief discursive and breakdown of my debate with Brother Augustine yesterday. For those of you who watched in my audience, I thank you for taking time out of your day that you would consider what I have to say beneficial to you, beneficial to your walk with Christ, and that I hope that you got something out of it. Needless to say, my debate opponent's behavior speaks for itself. There's no need to comment any further. One of the sort of characteristic marks of the early Credo Baptist in the Reformation period, both the radical reformers on the continent as well as the more measured and moderate early Baptists in England, was there eschewing of hatred and bigotry towards the imperial church representatives who persecuted them. There's a story of an Anabaptist as he was being chased during the winter time. He had escaped from a prison, and that he was being pursued by his pursuer, and they were going over a frozen lake, and his pursuer fell into the lake and was drowning after the ice had cracked and he had fallen through. And the Anabaptist turned around when he could have easily run his way to freedom and saved the life of the very man who had been trying to kill him. I think that is an attitude that all Christians should have towards those who speak ill of them, towards those who speak ill of their character, towards those who call them names and who speak wrongly, who speak evilly in an unjust manner against us, and who accuse us of denying the Lord whom we confidently know. And so that is all I will say about the decorum and the form of the debate. I pray for my opponent. I have no ill will towards him. I pray that he comes to have a true and saving knowledge in the Lord Jesus and his gospel, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again bodily from the dead on the third day according to the Scriptures. That is the gospel, and that is what defines the Christian faith. And that is why I wanted to do this debate. I feel that the entire edifice of the imperial church's claims, whether that be the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, to a lesser extent, and to a lesser extent the Church of the East, given the development of both Oriental Orthodoxy and the Church of the East in some places outside of the old Roman Empire. And to a lesser degree, some Lutherans and Anglicans who may take this perspective, but not by and large. Most Lutherans and Anglicans would not have this kind of triumphalist attitude. But I never felt, getting to the substance of the debate, my opponent did not answer a single point that I brought up in my opening statement regarding the Epistle to the Hebrews. The only time he even touched Hebrews was to go to the passage that I just read to insist that there is somehow being spoken of a physical altar within a church building, and that there is a sacrificial offering that is taking place on that altar at the hands of a priest. And that's just simply not the case of what the writer of Hebrews is talking about. The altar from whom we have a right to eat, that those who serve the Old Testament Jewish temple, at least in the day of the writer of the Hebrews, is Christ himself. And I believe the context, particularly looking down to verse 12 and verse 13, seeing the sufferings of Christ unjustly at the hands of unrighteous men for us and for our salvation, that is clearly the altar who is being spoken of. In regards to some of the things that he said, I'm going to get into this more tomorrow with vocab. We're going to talk about some of the specific arguments as well as probably the form of the debate as well. But I just reiterate, none of the essential aspects of my theses, my negative thesis, was dealt with. There was no attempt to try and understand the Protestant position generally, and especially a low church Protestant perspective. Even though my opponent ostensibly was converted into a Methodist church when he was supposedly converted to Christ. But there's one thing that you'll hear from whether it be Orthodox or Roman Catholics is that when people feel that they have found the one true church, they don't talk about conversion to Christ and to his gospel. They talk about conversion to the quote-unquote church. And once again, I believe this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the church is. They may wax ponderously about the importance of the visible church, and I do not deny that, but the visible church is the local church. It's the church on the ground, the congregation, which is the actual Greek term, ecclesia. You know, I'm not going to use the canard, quote-unquote, called out ones. That would be like calling a television far-seeing. Ecclesia is a technical term, regardless of what its original root word was, or the root words were that comprise that word, but it has a specific technical meaning. It's a congregation of people. Whether that be when a Greek herald would be coming back from a battle and the people would assemble in the town square, that was a congregation, or in its use in the Septuagint, when the congregation of Israel, I think of Psalm 22, which is quoted by the writer of Hebrews in chapter 2, you know, in the midst of the congregation, it's the midst of the church, I will sing your praise. And so there's a reason William Tyndale and the early English reformers translated the word congregation instead of church. I do believe in a universal church, but ultimately, what is the church but the true body of Christ, those who will all one day end up in heaven? And that is the fullness of the elect, those whom God knows and God alone knows. So I felt that that was something I may have needed to flesh out a little bit more, but we were clearly arguing from different presuppositions, and I don't think my opponent actually took time to understand what we believe. Everything he accused me of, he was the one who was doing that, whether it be not preparing for the debate or misrepresenting, characterizing, calling names, arguing in bad faith. But once again, I do not hate my debate opponent. That's not what this is about. But I think it is illustrative of their position. When you bow down before images, when you pray to dead people, when you deaden the senses in the time of worship with incense and with priestly vestments and with aesthetic. And I can rightly say on the opposite extreme, you have these large mega churches with, the mood lighting and the mood music, and it's trying to divorce the worshiper, the communicant, from his mind, from the mind that God has given him to hear and to understand and to believe the message that is being preached. It is promoting experience over conversion and faith. And this is why I would find myself in the camp of traditional Reformed Protestantism, in which we adhere to the regulative principle, in which if something is not commanded in worship, it is not something we are to do. And I believe that having a sacerdotal priesthood is at the heart and the core of what the Bible does not command Christians in the New Testament to do. To my first point, I think I argued convincingly, even if not fully, that the burden of proof that was on my opponent was that he had to demonstrate that there was a threefold office of ministry that was handed down in a divinely instituted way from Christ and his apostles. That is, that the apostles passed on their apostolic ministry into the episcopate, or into this idea of bishops who are over and against the elders, plural, of the local congregation. Every time he would go and point to the laying on of hands, I would just point him back, especially the 1 Timothy 4:14 passage, that it was the elders, plural, who laid their hands on Timothy, not a monarchical bishop. I don't even think he understood the language that I was using in talking about a monarchical bishop and how that is central to the claims of the modern Eastern Orthodox Church, as well as to the Roman Catholic Church and to the Oriental Orthodox, and to a lesser extent the Lutherans and the Anglicans, who also have an episcopal form of church government. I don't think he even recognized the history behind the various forms of ecclesiology that have developed down throughout the history of the church. Also, the word concept fallacy that he accused me of conflating elder and priest. Lexically, he's just mistaken. He's just wrong. Presbyter does not mean priest. Yes, priest derives etymologically from the term presbyter, but the term presbyter in its original sense did not mean priest. And it's very easy to demonstrate that. We were just reading from Isaiah today in church, and I was looking at the Septuagint, where God is talking about the judgment of the elders of Israel, and how the elders in Israel during Isaiah's day were misleading the people. And that is not a one-to-one with the priest. There's no idea of sacrifice and altar or cultic worship. And I use that in a technical sense, not a pejorative sense. There's no concept of a cultic office, cultic worship connected with the word presbyteros in the Greek, both in the Old Testament Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament for those in my audience who don't know, or in the Greek New Testament. There is a word hierus, which is where we get our term hierarchy from, that is directly used to translate the Hebrew word Cohen, which means priest, and that was in my opening statement. And so I believe my opponent failed to demonstrate rather catastrophically that that term hierus, or the concept of priestly service, in any way applies to the term presbyter. His understanding of that word is highly anachronistic, and he wanted to go to Tertullian to talk about how Tertullian, who he doesn't consider a saint, translated the word sacerdote. And it's like, yes, but that was my whole argument from reading Richard Hanson's book, The Christian Priesthood Examined, which he was very disrespectful of a very well-known early church historian and scholar who did a lot of the original work of modern church history on the Council of Nicaea, and who's a very well-respected theologian at Manchester University, who had done a lot of ecumenical work with Catholics and Methodists. And yes, I don't agree with Richard Hanson on everything. He's clearly influenced by higher criticism. He's clearly to the left of me, but that is one thing that I think I demonstrated, is that I can read from sources that are written by people who don't line up with me 100% and represent them accurately and fairly, recognize when they have superior knowledge to me, and I just don't believe my opponent did that. And so to that first point on the very nature of ecclesiology itself, the idea that there even was an official ministry established in the sense that you had officers in the church, when they would die, there would be automatic appointment. He brings up the example of Matthias in Acts, and it's like, well, after that, Matthias is never seen from or heard from again. And so I think he failed utterly on that point. And then my second and third points regarding the regarding the uniqueness of Christ's priesthood. And it's not just his high priesthood that is unique. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask. I saw somebody in the comments section who clearly did not understand what I was saying, which I'm not surprised that the Eastern Orthodox, who don't think about this in the way that Reformed Christians do, that they would completely misunderstand the argument that we were making. In Hebrews chapter 7, hold on one second. Verse 24, it says, "But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood." It's not his high priesthood. The word high is not in there. It's literally hierosune, which is priesthood. It's the same word that's used of the Jewish priesthood as a whole, not just the high priests. So it was on him to demonstrate that there are a special class of people within the New Covenant community that are priests over sacrifice and altar, in distinction from the general priesthood of believers, which one of my questions on 1 Peter was about, and in distinction from Christ's Melchizedek priesthood, and that was never demonstrated. Not only was it not demonstrated, it was never even dealt with, which I found fatal to his position. And the word aparabaton, which I think speaks for itself for those who know the Greek language. I'm a novice. I've read some of Mounce's Introduction to Greek. I have tried to be an autodidact in that area, but I picked up some things, but it's really the constructions of the words as opposed to the vocabulary of the language that has been most challenging, understanding what the verb tenses mean, what is the difference between the dative case and, which is an indirect pronoun or an indirect object versus the case that would designate something to be a direct object, and those are very challenging. And the language in Hebrews, especially from what I have heard, is in a more Attic or classical Greek style as opposed to the Koine Greek of the rest of the New Testament, which actually brings up the authorship when he talks about the Apostle Paul, which he once again did not even deal with. He was like, where in the early church did people take your interpretation of Hebrews? And I pointed him once again to the Hanson quote that in Dr. James White's debate with Mitchell Pacwa, they both sort of agreed that the fact that Hebrews had contested authorship, the very Tertullian who he quoted earlier thought it was written, the Epistle to the Hebrews was written by Barnabas. There was question as to his apostolicity, that sort of downplayed its influence in the early church. And so I gave a historical reason, something that's grounded in reality and in fact, in regards to the authority of Hebrews and the widespread knowledge or lack thereof of Hebrews in the early church, which curiously enough, Clement, the author of Clement's epistle, whoever he was, I think it is Clement, that he seems to know Hebrews, and it seems that maybe the earliest generation knows Hebrews well, but that as church history went on and as these issues became more debated, especially the authorship issue, that Hebrews sort of fell out of use, particularly with Origen and the rise of the allegorical interpretation, trying to see types and shadows in places where the New Testament doesn't draw that. The New Testament tells us explicitly where types and shadows can be found in the Old Testament, but there were developments in the early church that led beyond the bounds of the New Testament, which the canon issue is another issue. He kept appealing back to the authority of the church, which I knew exactly what he was going to do. My original debate thesis was, does the New Testament teach a sacerdotal priesthood? I had actually emailed him the Sunday night before when I sort of reviewed the language as I was doing my preparation. I was like, wait a second, it's been changed from the New Testament teaches to Christianity teaches. And to me, the latter debate thesis is not a good thesis because Christianity is a much broader term than the New Testament, and the thesis is much harder to falsify. So it doesn't actually make for a good thesis. Because on my end, you want a falsifiable thesis if you're taking the negative, but if you're taking the affirmative, you also want a falsifiable thesis because that means you can actually prove your point as well in the opposite direction. So I thought about canceling before then, but I knew that this needed to be done. I wanted to demonstrate Christian charity going into a hostile environment. And once again, like I said, I have no ill will towards my opponent. I pray for him. I pray that he comes to a true knowledge of the gospel. I remember just poring over hours and hours and hours of his videos and just my heart going out to him. It's like, man, this guy, he was not raised in a Christian home the way that I was and did not have that benefit. Were my parents perfect? No. Was there a sense of nominalism at times in our house? Absolutely. But they still knew where to take me so that I could hear the Bible, so that I could hear the Christian gospel. And he only discovered this 5 years ago, or 7 years ago, if you want to go back to his story with the lady in the Whole Foods who bought him the Bible, who was probably a low church Protestant like me, which was my whole point of referencing that story in my closing statement. I felt in terms of the argument from Hebrews 7 and the uniqueness of Christ's priesthood, there was no knowledge of what I was even saying. I don't think there had ever been given deep consideration that I would go to Hebrews in this debate, which is shocking to me, considering that Hebrews is the book in the New Testament that discusses the form and function of the Christian priesthood, which I made clear in my opening statement. I do not deny that there is a Christian priesthood. I just deny that there is a special sacerdotal priesthood in the New Testament. And I think I demonstrated that rather thoroughly. But to my third point, in Hebrews chapter 10, talking about the Eucharist, and he wanted to sort of say, oh, this is once saved, always saved. And it's like, you're not understanding the deeper and subtler point that I'm making, that the sacrifice that is offered by the priest is deeply connected with the concept of priesthood to begin with. That you can't discuss the issue of priesthood without discussing the issue of the sacrifice. And this idea of the Eucharist as a cultic sacrifice that is administered by priests is something that is not only unknown in the New Testament, but when I kept pushing him on Justin Martyr and Ignatius and Irenaeus, you just don't see them use this language. Ignatius doesn't refer to either the bishop or to the presbyters as priests in a unique sense. He doesn't describe what they do in terms of sacrifice and altar, which was the whole point that I was making, is that there is a development of these doctrines. So he talked about Cyprian and John Chrysostom, and I'm like, yes. By the time Cyprian comes around, who, though Tertullian gives us the language of priesthood that later is used, he doesn't connect it with the Eucharistic offering. The role and the function of the priest in Tertullian's mind is not connected with a Eucharistic sacrifice. So Tertullian's concept of priesthood is totally different than the modern Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox concept of priesthood. And to that point, he goes to Cyprian. It's like, yes, exactly. Cyprian is the first one to really connect all of these earlier developments. Ignatius raising the bishop over against the presbyters, even though I mentioned that form of church government where you have in Ignatius's mind, a congregational bishop, not a diocesan bishop, the way that modern Catholics and Orthodox have. That yes, that was a development in that direction, and then Tertullian makes further development in that direction. And then finally, Cyprian ties these points together. But Cyprian's writing around 250 AD, nearly 200 years after the time of the apostles. That'd be like me today writing about what happened 200 years ago with Joseph Smith in upstate New York. It's in the United States, but it's not in the same region I was at. Cyprian was writing in Carthage. He was not writing in Palestine. And he was writing about events that happened 200 years before him. Cyprian had a lot of admirable qualities. I remember reading about him both in Schaff and in Hansen. But at the same time, Cyprian, because of his situation of persecution and not really being able to have a lot of theological training, I doubt Cyprian actually gave a full exposition of the Epistle to the Hebrews and how Hebrews connects to the understanding of priesthood in the Christian faith. It's just not there. And then by the time you get to Chrysostom, you're talking about over 300 years plus, somewhere around 320 years after the time of the apostles, writing about issues, in a completely different cultural context. The Jewish temple is gone at that point. All of the original apologetic context of the early church was just wasn't there anymore. And so particularly as the church began to be more and more Gentile, as you had the allegorical interpretation come in, as you had these earlier developments in Ignatius and Tertullian and Cyprian, by the time you get to John Chrysostom, he's even using pagan terminology for the pagan priesthood of the Roman religion to describe Christian priests. Now, we can talk about whether that terminology is rightly applied and whether that's a proper development, but it is a development nonetheless, which goes back to his point about Vincent of Lorraine, this idea of Catholicity and, universality. And that's exactly what I was appealing to, is like, you can't say this was universal or that this is apostolic in its origin. And Hansen, I think, draws that out beautifully in his book. So the point that I was making about the Eucharist is that if the Eucharist is the same sacrifice of Christ, it should accomplish the same thing that Christ's sacrifice does, which is actual forgiveness for his people. And there was a lot of pejoratives and hand-waving about Calvinism and eternal damnation in the comment section. I just blow that all aside because it's not what Calvin is teaching. We don't believe in equal ultimacy as Reformed Christians. The doctrine of election is not equal in application or character or kind to the doctrine of reprobation. I'd love to see how my opponent would try to walk through Romans 9, which is a book that Thomas Hopko says Christians should probably read last. I think it's because if you read Romans, you start getting ideas about things like justification by faith and predestination and election, and this is why my opponent would not go there either. But the whole point that I was making is that as Christ holds his priesthood ta dianekes, that's, for all time. So also he has perfected for all time in chapter 10 those whom he is sanctifying. That sanctification is an ongoing present tense participial form. And yes, we are being sanctified currently, right now, as Christians, but that Christ, from God's perspective, and this really comes down to the difference of the two big issues of synergism versus monergism, which the Eastern Orthodox slanderously conflate monoenergism, the 8th century heresy related to the monothelite controversy with monergism. The idea that Christ only had one energy, or that God only had one energy, has nothing to do. That's a theological term, whereas monergism is a soteriological term. I've heard countless Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox who will go to Philippians chapter 2, and they will try to say, so then my beloved, just as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. And yes, I am quoting. I'm not looking at a screen when I'm quoting Philippians 2 because I've actually memorized the verses. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and they fail to go to the very next verse. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. But once again, I think when you pray to dead people, yes, even people who may be saints, but they don't know. This is another issue. The idea that we know infallibly who's in heaven, that the church can somehow determine, this guy from the 8th century is in heaven. How do you know that? That's presumptuous, which is why we don't pray to saints. And even that is a development. It used to be praying for the saints in the earliest periods of the church, but once again, this is development in doctrine that happens, that the Orthodox just can't handle that. They just cannot handle the concept that there has been development in ecclesiology, theology, soteriology, that we have to understand the development of tradition not as something of divine origin or institution, but as something that happens in history that we have to deal with, which is the point that I made about how all of the original patristic sources and scholarship in the modern age was done primarily by Protestants and a number of Roman Catholics who would not be seen favorably by the papacy in the late 19th century, which is, I'll do a review of my book, The Pope and the Professor, on the life of Johann Ignaz von Dollinger, or Dollinger, I believe is a fascinating figure from the Vatican I era. And anyways, yes, I think that's to be deep in history to me is to be Protestant, because only we can really take people for who they are, where they were at their specific time in history. We don't have to turn the early church fathers into Reformed Baptists, as I said, but what we say is that there's precedent for what we believe is Reformed Baptist in church history. It's a completely different mindset. Sorry, I had to pause there for a second, folks. I was helping my wife bring in some supplies from the store and bring in my young son as well. Yes, and that's another thing I wanted to bring up, just to sort of sum up the theological stuff and then get into just my final thoughts about the form of the debate and sort of the different paradigms and the presuppositional issues, and where dialogue may occur going forward. Once again, I just don't feel that any of my points were adequately addressed at any point. That I was curious in what he had to say. I really wanted to know how they dealt with the COVID issue on their side. As far as my local church is concerned, we were closed for like the first 2 to 3 weeks, the 15 days to flatten the curve. My elders, or the main preaching pastor, who's one of the elders, he went to our local county sheriff's department and was like, hey, we're planning to start meeting again. Like, are you guys going to do anything? There's a lot of crime in our local area. And sheriffs were like, we have no time or desire to go and try and enforce COVID lockdown rules on simple Christian congregations when there's a lot of other crime that's going on that needs to be dealt with. So we were back to meeting within 3 weeks after the initial shutdown, and that was originally outside, and then by the beginning of May, we were back at full capacity inside. People, if they wanted to wear masks, they could. If they wanted to social distance, they could. We were leaving that up to conscience, but for those who felt that they needed to be back with the congregation in person, that's what we were doing. And, I won't say too much about that for fear of cancellation, of course, even though I am a physician and have more knowledge than most, and I don't say that arrogantly. I just say that as a matter of fact regarding the current situation that we're going through in our country. But anyways, like I asked the COVID question because it's like you guys have changed the liturgy and you have shut people out from the sacraments during the COVID pandemic, and yet given your understanding of the Eucharist as a propitiatory sacrifice offered up by priests, why did your bishops and your presbyters, your local parish priests, cut off the congregation, cut off the laity from the sacraments? Something my church did not do. And there was no real answer there except to gloss it over like, oh, well, you don't know what we believe, about the Eucharist. And it's like, yeah, I realize you believe people can be saved outside of the normative means, but that was the whole point that I quoted the Lawrence Fairley quote, where he was talking about how the Eucharistic penitent reception of the Eucharist in a lifelong manner is the normative means of salvation within the Orthodox Church. And so I didn't hear a good response to my question there. So it's like, if you truly believe what you believe about the Eucharist, why the lack of resistance to tyrannical dictates, if that's what you believe they were? And why the lack of interest or seriousness in what's going on with the abuse of the sacraments and the shutting the people off from those sacraments? So I found that just very curious, very strange, that we in my local congregation seem to actually value that more than an imperial church congregation does. And we actually have recourse. I can go and talk to my elders. I can go and talk to my deacons. And by the way, they helped me prepare for this debate. I was not off here as a lone Christian, doing what I do. I was doing this with the full knowledge and full support of the elders and deacons of my church. So that was another thing. He was like, oh, private interpretation. It's like, it's not private interpretation. Once again, this comes back to their faulty anachronistic understanding of apostolic succession. So I just thought that was disingenuous on his part. Back to the form. I don't think my opponent actually understood what a classical formal debate is. I do not have to try and rebut him in my opening statement. That's what I tried to do in my rebuttal. I was typing out some of the points that he made, and I knew exactly where he was going to go in the Fathers and in John chapter 20, and had prepared for that. He was like, well, he's just lost the debate because he didn't actually, try to rebut me in his opening statement. It's like, that's not the point of my opening statement. The point of my opening statement is for me to state my negative case for the thesis, and then I will interact with your opening statement in my rebuttal. And he made the fatal mistake of yielding the floor to me and allowing me to talk as long as I wanted to in my rebuttal, which I actually found that was the hardest part of the debate for me, was the rebuttal period, because I was able to write out my opening statement and write out my closing statement and write out all the questions based off of the research that I had done on him and on the Orthodox Church beforehand. And there was just, this is my first formal debate. I felt that I addressed some of the points adequately. Yeah, there's room for improvement there, and I recognize that. But still, I got to speak for a lot longer relative to him. And then I think it just continued to spiral from there. And I'm not talking about his behavior at this point. I'm talking about the tactics of how he used his time. I'm talking about the formal aspect of the debate here. He would make long statements. Some people that were watching from my side called them diatribes. I will leave that for the audience to decide for themselves. But he didn't ask questions during the Q&A, and that's why I wanted 2 rounds of cross-examination, because I know cross-examination from watching Dr. White and a number of other formal scholastic debates, that cross-examination, strictly timed cross-examination, is where the real debate is at, when you get to press your opponent with questions. And he thought my questions were nonsensical, but I actually think they were really trying to touch on the issues of sacerdotal priesthood. Just because I don't have the Eastern Orthodox conception specifically in mind for every question, I'm really trying to get at the root and the core of the issue. And by him, making statements and not really asking me many questions during the time of cross-examination, he just yielded me 20 minutes, basically free reign to just pepper him with questions, to just, blitzkrieg him with a number of different questions. I tried to focus on theological topics in the first round and then really get into ecclesiology in the second round of cross-ex. Sort of doing a chiastic construction to my debate, starting with ecclesiology in my opening statement, going to theology at the latter part of my opening statement, coming back to ecclesiology and the rebuttal, going back to theology. Maybe it's more of a sine wave than a chiastic construction. Going back to theology in the first round of cross-ex, and then hitting on ecclesiology in the second round of cross-ex. And he just didn't have a response to my questions. He started asking me questions after the formal debate was over during the Q&A period, when he had a bunch of his, the home team, so to speak, was, asking a bunch of questions in the chat, many of which didn't directly have to do with the thesis at hand. They tried to go to 1 Corinthians 11 and talk about, why are people getting sick and falling asleep? I thought that was kind of a little bit out of left field and something I'm keeping in mind for potential future engagements. And I went and read John Gill's commentary on it afterwards, and it's like the point I was trying to make even during the debate is like, well, even if you believe this, what the context of that is that you have some in the Corinthian church who are eating and gorging themselves because the Lord's Supper was often celebrated in the context of an actual meal in the early church, which is something the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't do today. For us, we don't do it in the Protestant world, but once again, we recognize that the Lord's Supper in the context of the love feast, or the agape as it was called in the early church, was not something that was prescribed. It was something that was just described. Is that they were eating in an unworthy manner by neglecting the poor in their midst. And so God was using judgment upon them. But to then make that a universal application throughout the church for all time, which maybe there is a universal application in a sense, but there's people who eat the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist in a number of different contexts around the world who don't get sick and who don't die from it. Paul's not saying this is definitely going to happen to everyone who does that, but he tried to make the point, the real presence, and it's like, whether or not one believes in the carnal presence of the Lord in the supper or not, that still doesn't have to do directly with it. It's definitely related, but it's not a one-to-one correlation to either the sacerdotal nature of the priesthood and the idea that the Eucharist is a propitiatory sacrifice, and the context that people were falling asleep, or which means dying or getting sick from eating it in an unworthy manner. God can bring judgment as he wishes, regardless of the substance of the bread and wine, and whether you have a carnal presence of Christ or not. And I specifically use the term carnal presence as opposed to real presence, because a spiritual presence can be seen as a real presence. There's a number of different views that Protestants take on the Eucharist. I personally have a spiritual presence view, not that the elements themselves somehow uniquely contain the Spirit of God, but when the local congregation gathers together, Christ is there with us in our midst in a unique way in the partaking of the supper, which is what our confession states, which he said he had read, but he did not once reference during our debate. So, but getting back to sort of the breakdown, I think cross-ex was a total victory for our side. He did not even engage. And then he would the final straw, and where I think the debate was not the battle was already won, but I think it was just conclusively, illustratively won during the closing statement, in which once again he seemed to have lost interest in the debate halfway through. And as I was making my closing statement, and I made the point that I did from Spurgeon, knowing it would elicit this kind of response, but I think it was necessary. When I went into the Spurgeon quote, quoting about, Spurgeon saying, "Let no man call himself specially a priest, come to you saying that he's a priest in any way that you as a common Christian cannot claim for yourself. And that away with such a man, he imposes upon you, that it's a blasphemy." And he was like, "I'm not going to let this heretic." He interrupted me during my closing statement, which at that point, debate's over, man. You lost. And not only did you lose, you would have been disqualified in any formal competition for interrupting your opponent's closing statement. That is sacrosanct time, regardless of how you may feel about your opponent's position. I've seen debates between Christians and Muslims where, yes, what the Christian believes about God is blasphemous to the Muslim, and what the Muslim believes about God is blasphemous to the Christian, and yet they are able to comport themselves within the rigid confines of a structured, formal, moderated debate. And the fact that my opponent interrupted me would have been an automatic disqualification, and would have given the debate to me by default. So I think that's enough of the post-mortem. I want to thank Roosh for his moderation. I think he did a good job keeping time. It was his first time moderating. I want to be very charitable in that regard. Just feedback I would have for him is that for future formal moderated debates, that it's his job as the moderator if one of the debaters is going outside of the bounds of the debate and the bounds of the specific section of the debate that we're in. So, for instance, the cross-examination, if the guy it's his turn to cross-examine his opponent, and he is making statements and not asking questions, it's the moderator is supposed to come in at that point and say, you need to ask questions, like stop making statements. And he needs to come in at that point. He also needs to control the emotions of the debate as best as he can, saying, calm down, like, let's bring it back together, bring it in, let's, suck it up and get through it regardless of how you may feel about your opponent. Look, I'm not any more righteous in and of myself than my debate opponent. I know that because I know the gospel, and I know my sin, and my need for my Lord every single day. But I trust in his sovereign grace. I trust in his work, his finished work in me. Can I be deceiving myself? Yes, that's what the warning passages in scriptures are for. But we can have reasonable assurance. If we be walking in the faith, we can have assurance that we're saved. It's not an infallible assurance because we're not fully glorified yet. But it's the hope that we hold to, and that's what the writer of Hebrews so emphatically is. He's saying, but we are concerned of, even when he gives the warning passages in Hebrews at the end of chapter 6, he says, we are convinced of better things concerning you. At the end of chapter 12, but we are convinced you are those who will not fall away. That there's encouragement there. Yes, there's sharp warning, but that's like, look to Christ. Look what he has done perfectly. He doesn't lose those for whom he died. He doesn't lose those for whom he intercedes. He's alive in heaven. Do you not see how great our Savior is? And that was really the saddest part to me when my opponent started calling me a heretic and a blasphemer and saying that I lied about Jesus. Just because I don't believe that Christ limits the ability to forgive sins to his apostles, which they are not called apostles in John chapter 20, they are called disciples. I was making a lexical argument there that he is not referring to them in their apostolic office. He is referring to them as disciples, and that this is something that is given to the church as a whole. That the disciples are not separated in and of themselves from the church. Yes, they are special. But this comes back to the idea of how can you say that these gifts are then transferred specially to some sort of class of priests or bishops? That was the whole burden of proof upon him. And so really the idea of the priesthood, in the functional sense, it has to do with the nature of the priesthood, the nature of the sacrifice. But in the formal sense, it has to do with apostolic succession, which is why I went there. And it's like you can't demonstrate that the apostles passed on these gifts specially to the laying on of hands to bishops. I mean, Timothy was itinerant. He was not a bishop, and that was one of the points that Schaff makes in discussing the fact that the monarchical episcopate is a development. This is not a universal practice in the early church. It's not a universal form of church government from the very beginning, and he failed to demonstrate that. But once again, like I said, I pray for my opponent. I have no ill will towards him. We're to pray for those who persecute us, and he treated me as you all saw he treated me. And I'm not going to gloat. I'm not going to claim victory. I believe the debate speaks for itself. And I deeply care about my Eastern Orthodox neighbors, friends, even those who would slander me and revile me and speak ill of me and call me a blasphemer when I believe and I hold to the gospel, and I'm defending the uniqueness of the only priest that I know who is special, the only special priest that I know who is Christ himself. Yes, there's a general priesthood of believers. We are called kings and priests, as Spurgeon says in that quote that I quoted in my closing statement. But ultimately, the only sacerdotal priest we have is Christ himself. Is he not enough? This is something Calvin talks about in the Institutes. You had people who could not stand that God and God alone would get the glory for the salvation of men. You had to have saints, you had to have bishops, you had to have popes take credit. And these are, I want to sort of finish off this talking about a couple of first principles and sort of more meta aspects to this debate. The first of those is that what I have seen, whether it be within Catholicism, with something like the Journey Home Network or Eastern Orthodoxy, when you hear their adherents talk about the gospel and about conversion, they always de-emphasize. I'm not going to say it's never there, but they always de-emphasize conversion to Christ, discovering Christ and his uniqueness and his goodness and his perfection and his love and his perfect sacrifice, the rest, the peace in Christ. What they talk about is conversion to the church. They talk about how I found orthodoxy. I remember I went to the local parish here where I live with my colleague, and precious people. I love them. I love the priest Patrick there. I love the people who are in that building. But the lady asked me, it's like, so when did you first learn about orthodoxy? It wasn't, so tell me about how you came to know Jesus. And to me, that's sad. Yes, there is a connection between Christ and his church, but it's finding the institutional church, the organizational church, beyond the local congregation. And to me, that shows me where their spiritual state is at. Do I believe there are true Christians in the Eastern Orthodox Church? Yeah, I do. I think there's some. But I think the official teachings of the Eastern Orthodox Church, if someone was to buy into all of them, I can't reconcile that with the biblical gospel. And so that's why I pray for my opponents. And this comes back to sort of the final sort of meta point, or the second meta point I wanted to talk about is because of the collapse of evangelicalism, and especially the woke movement, the collapse of Catholicism, the collapse of the family in Western and American society, people are looking for tradition. They're looking for something to hold on to. But this is something Dr. White talks about, and I was talking about with a friend of mine who's a Presbyterian, and supposedly we're not part of the same church, and yet we recognize we're both part of the body of Christ. Even if we may be in different denominations, is that there's a lot of people out there who want certainty at the expense of truth. Never trade truth for certainty. That's why I believe my opponent did the things that he did, said the things that he said, is because he could not handle that not only did I not agree with him, but that maybe I would say something that would cause him to have a little grain of sand of doubt about the particular exclusive truth claims of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Not the Christian gospel or Christianity in general, but about his church. He is tying his salvation to his church, not to his Christ. And that's a sign of immaturity. It's a sign of weakness, and I believe it's a sign of someone who's unregenerate. That he wants certainty at the expense of truth. He cannot honestly investigate the early church. He cannot honestly investigate the New Testament. Not because he's a bad guy or he's dishonest, in a special way, but the unregenerate mind cannot handle the light of Christ. It cannot handle the light of truth when truth is shined. It says men hated the light because they loved darkness. Praying before images, lighting candles, crossing yourself as if this is something special, believing that in icons there is the divine energies of God in some mysterious way, praying to saints, incense, sacerdotalism, viewing the Eucharist as a propitiatory sacrifice. that has a moral impact upon the worshiper. And yeah, that is some Calvinism for you, but that's also some Bible for you. That's some Romans 1. That's from Romans 8. The mind set on the flesh is death. It is hostile towards God, for it is not even able to submit itself to the law of God. We're not sick people, as the Eastern Orthodox Church would say, who need to be made well. We are dead men who need to be made alive. And I understand that very well as somebody who has performed many autopsies. So that is my debate breakdown. Once again, I have no ill will towards my opponent. I let the debate speak for itself. I pray for my opponent. I pray that he comes to know the true Jesus, the Jesus who is alive in heaven, the perfect high priest, the only priest of our confession. And that he would come to know rest, as that woman at the Whole Foods went and brought him the Bible, because this common person, this common woman, just showing the love of Christ, being a true priest of Christ to him by bringing him the Word of God. And that's my heart for this channel. Guys, I have so many of my own problems. I deal with my own sin every day. I have a very busy job as a physician. I'm a husband. I'm a father. This is not something I'm doing for money. I make nothing off of making these YouTube videos. That's not my motivation here. My motivation is to bring the truth of the gospel. That's what Dr. Bob is all about. Because I know how dead I was in my sins, and how much I have betrayed my Lord in the past, and yet how perfect and wonderful and amazing of a Savior he truly is, that he would save a wretch like me, as the old hymn, Amazing Grace, goes. So, grace and peace to you all. Please keep it civil in the comment sections. Don't speak ill or evilly of my opponent, or of Eastern Orthodox people who are precious in the sight of God. So yeah, love all of you guys. I care for you. I want to continue to comport myself in a way that a true Christian man should, in the fear of his Lord, but most importantly for love of his Lord, because his Lord first loved him. And so I'll be putting out a few videos coming up. I'm actually planning on doing a book review of Christian Priesthood Examined by Bishop and Dr. Richard Hanson. The late Bishop Richard Hanson. His brother A.T. Hanson was also apparently a theologian and a scholar within the Anglican Communion. And then I plan on putting out another book review of The Pope and the Professor when I finally get around to finishing that. And I'll keep you all apprised of any further developments. And tomorrow night I will be on Vocab's stream at 7:30 to do a more in-depth debate breakdown, which I've heard he's been spreading this to some big-name apologists within the Reformed world. So I'm interested to see who actually takes the time to see the presentation that I've made and the exposition of Hebrews, and I hope it's a blessing. But that's all I'm going to say for now. So you all have a good night, and yes, grace and peace from Jesus Christ, our Savior.